everybody, and welcome on the podcast. Today, my guest is again Dr. Gary Fettke for a second interview. Gary, welcome again, and thank you for coming back.
Clement, thank you very much. I obviously didn't get it right the first time, so we're going to have another go.
Yeah, well, we did it right, but we're going to go further today. Last time, we've been mainly talking about the importance of doctors to stay educated and informed on science. But in today's episode, I'd like to talk more specifically about certain foods like cereals and seed oils that may be highly toxic for the human body. So my first questions would be, are cereals a safe and effective source of energy for the human body? And could you please explain what would be the human body's requirement for energy?
No is the simple answer. Cereals, and whether or not it's breakfast or any time of the day, is actually a very poor source of nutrition. It may provide energy, but it's not actually that nutritious, and it comes with a whole lot of side effects, which is really sort of gets down to science and biochemistry. How do we put it in a nutshell? Look, we evolved without cereals. They came into existence in our agricultural revolution probably about 10,000 years ago. And at that time, our ancestors tried chewing them because there was no milling or grinding or cooking or baking. And because there was no milling, you can look at the skeletons from post-agricultural revolution skeletons and look at the teeth, and they're all being ground down to nothing. Pre-agricultural revolution skeletons, their teeth were in fact far better condition. So, they can actually track those, look at the onset of putting cereals and grains into our diet back 10,000 years. And I'll go off, I'm hopeless. I go off on sidetracks.
No,
There's a scientific psychologist by the name of Peter Osterberg who's in Finland. And Peter introduced me to the concept that the very first introduction of cereals into our diet was probably at 14,000 years ago. So the agricultural revolution is 10,000 years ago. But the first documentation of us having cereal products was actually beer and bread. And it's the very first time in our evolution that we actually ate something for hedonistic pleasure. Because there's no evolutionary gain to us putting cereals and grains and carbohydrates into our diet. So you can sort of imagine that some seed or barley or wheat product or something like fell into a pool of water and then fermented in that situation. And then somebody came by and drank that water. In fact, that was an early beer. So that's the very first documentation about 14,000 years ago of an introduction of a food for our pleasure. And that's when the downfall started happening. So before we started farming and the cereals, there was actually a hedonistic introduction for us as humans to having cereal and grain. So, in the modern era, so from an ancestral point of view, our diets were based in, and we've talked about this before, is that I believe that the perfect diet, it should be fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That is an animal-based diet because the only things you're going to get all year round are animal-based product. In the Nordic countries, they are not going to ever get cereals and grains and bananas and tropical fruits. You're in Switzerland, there are a whole lot of foods that, you've got snow there. There are the whole seasons when you can't actually get access to food. You can't get access to plant-based product unless it's been transported in. So our ancestral diet did not have grains and cereals in it. It was literally introduced around the Mediterranean, more at a tropical climate, which actually could sustain that, or a low temperate climate, not a high temperate climate. I mean by latitude. And so the introduction of breakfast, of cereal per se, really only came at the late 1890s with the introduction of breakfast cereal by the Kellogg's group, the Kellogg's brothers, William Keith and John Harvey Kellogg. And then following on from that, we've had more and more cereal production, but it is of actually no benefit to us. And the whole movement for our diet to be 40 to 50 to 60% carbohydrate is not based on science. It's based on production of a food product which is there for the profitability of the companies and not for the actual health of ourselves. So two sideways slants there. One is there is no biochemical pathway in the body that requires us to eat carbohydrate. There is no requirement for us to eat glucose nor fructose, and they're the two main ones.
Mm-hmm.
So from an energy source point of view, God, our creator, whichever way you want to look at it, gave us a metabolism which was not dependent on a seasonally available carbohydrate. Bearing in mind the natural carbohydrates that we have, which we can eat in season, are fruit and honey if you want to climb a tree and break into the beehive, and breast milk.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. All the cereals, the grains, the products, the breads, the rices, and all that sort of thing have been introduced into our dietary picture primarily because they are cheap and easy to produce. They have long shelf life and they have transportability. And because of that, they're very profitable for processed food companies to introduce it into our diet. And not just introduce it into our diet, make guidelines which are dependent on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, really one of my, I was about to use the word beef. I don't know if it's in the slang of that's my beef. We've had something introduced to us which was not evolutionary, and the production of it in the mass that we have at this point in time is not a non-requirement, and it's actually not beneficial. So I don't know which one of those paths you want to go down. We can talk about the biochemistry, we can talk about how it was brought in by the food industry, and then we can talk about the manipulation of our guidelines by the food industry, because they're all of equal importance.
Yeah, and maybe if you could just dig a little bit further into the toxicity of a high amount of cereals or grains, and what could be the side effects for the human bodies.
Well, we the theoretical benefits which have been pushed upon us by the food industry are that carbohydrates are essential for our health, well-being, and energy, and fiber is essential for our gut health.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about it. So if we look at carbohydrates, whether or not it's glucose or fructose, so sugar is half glucose, half fructose. Most things are made up of the monosaccharides, and they've got disaccharides, which is two of them together, and then polysaccharides when you've got lots of them linked up together. But effectively, the other two major components of carbohydrate. And so some of my lectures are on YouTube about fructose and carbohydrate and how they're actually harmful to the system. And so in excess, fructose goes down several pathways, giving us liver troubles. Because if you want to make wine or alcohol, you ferment it. And it's the fructose component of fruit which is converted into wine. Well, our liver does exactly the same thing. It has an aldehyde pathway on the liver. So if you eat fructose, it gets converted into alcohol. And with the amount of sugar in today's society, we've got a massive problem with a thing called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 8% of 10-year-olds have got it.
Wow.
Children. Yes, we've got liver disease in children related to
Wow.
their sugar consumption. There are other pathways of fructose metabolism affecting our circulation, our blood pressure control, our immunological aspect, our eating habits, because it drives hunger, it drives behavior. And then it's also converted into a small, dense LDL particle, a lipoprotein, which when they become oxidized, and we can come back to that later when we're talking about cetols, when that small, dense lipoprotein becomes oxidized, that causes a whole variety of conditions in our blood vessel walls, inflammation, cardiovascular disease. I think that's a real kicker, that inflammatory path. The other side of that is glucose. And so glucose, first of all, to say, in the amounts we have in society now, 40% of it's turned into fructose. It's a really important thing. If you don't think you're eating sugar and you're only eating glucose, no, 40% of that gets converted over into fructose with all the fructose problems. But the other thing which is unique about glucose, it's actually quite toxic to us. So my COVID research was to say, okay, if we're going to demonize carbohydrates, I'm going to look into the science of it. It's another talk that's been seen 500,000 times or something like that, but I came up with what a toxic dose is. And to me, I said, okay, toxicity is when it has a negative impact on the system. And I came up with the figure that it was 4 grams of glucose, which is 1 teaspoon. It's 1/5 of a slice of bread. It's 1/20th of a bowl of cereal. 1/15th of a bowl of rice. And what I found, if you look through the research and the science, is that glucose, when it hits the system, when it gets absorbed by the gut, starts getting absorbed in the mouth and then through the gut all the way through, when that blood glucose then goes up the liver and then spreads around the body, it has an immediate toxic effect on the lining of the blood vessels, called the endothelium. Most people think that the biggest organ in the body is the skin, but the lining of our blood vessels is actually much, much, much bigger. And it's actually a very active layer that produces nitric oxide, which actually opens up the blood vessels. Most people might have heard of nitric oxide because of Viagra, the thing which gives you an erection because it opens up the blood vessels to the penis. So it gives people an erection. But our bodies are producing nitric oxide, which has a very, very short half-life of a microsecond. But nonetheless, that's all produced by the endothelial layer to allow our blood vessels to open up and for the blood cells to go through them. When you give it a dose of glucose, that layer is damaged for several hours. It will regrow, but it's damaged. And it's an immediate effect. So people think, oh, have your carbs or carbohydrates. You're actually damaging every blood vessel in every corner of the body. Another thing is that glucose, when it comes into the body does everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream because of that primary toxicity. So everyone talks about glucose and carbs being essential. I took the flip side and say, how come the body does everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream? So if it's so good for us, why does the body want to get rid of it and store it? And it's because of that effect on the glycocalyx, on the endothelium, that layer there. Glucose also, to get it out of the bloodstream, requires a secretion of insulin from the pancreas. And the pancreas actually then secretes that insulin, and insulin immediately takes the glucose out of the bloodstream and pushes into the fat, moves it into fat storage. The flip side of insulin is a hormone called glucagon, which keeps your blood glucose up a little bit. But glucagon is never over-secreted to give you hyperglycemia, a blood glucose that's too high. It's only the food we eat that gives us a glucose that's too high. It gets spiked up a bit with exercise and adrenaline, but it's very transient. there are only 3 cells in the body that require glucose. One's our red blood cells, the erythrocytes. The other one's is in the lens of the eye, and the other one is a cell called the thin layer of the loop in the loop of Henle in the kidney. Very tiny. And the very small amount of glucose that the body requires can be produced by gluconeogenesis, or that small amount that we may have in our bloodstream. We do not need the massive amounts. We can go down a few other biochemical pathways, but effectively glucose, I think, is taken out of the bloodstream immediately. The other
So
thing, I'll talk, one other thing is the Maillard reaction. Did we talk about that last time, the cooking term?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so it's essentially from a cooking aspect, when food goes brown, that's
Uh-huh.
called the Maillard reaction.
Mhm.
And that is a combining of glucose with protein under the effect of heat. That's cooking. It's a caramelization. Now, the same thing happens if your blood glucose goes up. If your blood glucose goes up, your tissue glucose goes up nearly the same amount. But under the effect of body heat, the glucose combines with the protein in your tissues, and you are effectively toasting, browning every tissue in the body when the blood glucose goes up. So is it any wonder that those people with uncontrolled blood glucoses, which is diabetes, end up toasting their brain, they're toasting their eyes, they're toasting their kidneys, every single organ of the body. Even their skin over time gets brown and fibrotic, and that's a classic Maillard reaction in action. If we come back, you talked about energy right at the very first question. There's a thing called the Krebs cycle. It's a biochemical thing, a pathway. It's in the early pages of all physiology and biochemistry textbooks. It's not rocket science. It's how every cell in living creatures, animal, human, insects, converts food into energy, and the major energy source for the body is adenosine triphosphate, ATP, travels around, and it's produced in the mitochondria. Now you can drag out any picture of a Krebs cycle. The end product, fuel that we require in a cell, is ATP. But it can come from carbohydrates, glucose. It can come from proteins, and it can come from fat. In fact, arguably the most efficient way is coming from fat, with the least number of side effects. So, again, coming back to God, God's very clever, because we have the ability to store fat in our bodies and convert that back to energy. Our primary food source from an evolutionary aspect has been animal-based product all year round, which provides us with essential proteins, essential fats, essential micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. That's animal-based foods. Carbohydrates are plant-based primarily: fruit, cereals, grains. Honey, arguably animal-based, but not that easy to get hold of. Carbohydrate is seasonally available. That's when a fruit's on a tree. So our system is designed to actually survive without carbohydrate. But carbohydrates are coming primarily to us as humans as fruit at the end of summer, beginning of autumn, just before winter hibernation. Now, if you're a bear or an animal, you will eat as much fruit when it comes into season to get fat for winter hibernation. We as humans, and fruit, because of some of the pathways of increasing hunger via fructose, actually drives behavior. So if you eat sugar, if you eat fructose, you eat glucose, which gets converted to fructose, you will be constantly hungry, because that's what fructose is meant to do in nature.
So would you?
So in nature, we're supposed to eat fruit so we can get fat for winter hibernation, and we will drive this behavior. And a lot of it's fructose. And so the food industry loves this product. It puts it in all of our food, so we buy more of their product.
But what would you say to some people who say, okay, I heard people arguing that fruits are okay, but high fructose corn syrup, for example, is not okay. Fruits are not high fructose corn syrup. For you, is that the same, or does it have the same effect
Well,
at the end?
sugar is 50% glucose, 50% fructose.
Mm.
High fructose corn syrup is about 55% fructose, 45% glucose. It's a bit sweeter.
Mm.
Same as honey. Honey is a bit more fructose than glucose. Fruit across the board has a variety of amounts of fructose and glucose. They're just fructose and glucose. I don't care how it comes, whether or not it's in honey or fruit or high fructose corn syrup or cereals or grains. It is exactly the same biochemical pathways that it travels down. And you can argue that high fructose corn syrup is a more processed product. And people use the argument that fruit comes with fiber in it, which slows up the glycemic index, decreases it. It comes with micronutrients and vitamins. The long and the short of it, if we don't actually eat carbohydrate, you actually don't need much vitamin C at all.
Mm-hmm.
Number one. Number two, if you're looking at the minerals, the zinc, for instance, of the calcium, you're looking at what's bananas going on about? What are they? Got a blank. It's advertised as being high in certain things. All of those things are in much higher amounts in green vegetables and in animal-based products. So the whole benefits of potassium, sorry, that was bananas. If you're looking at, you can get all that from a whole variety of other sources without the sugars and the carbohydrates. Apples have about the same amount of sugar as Coca-Cola. Bananas have got more sugar than Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is about 10% sugar. Bananas are around 16 to 24% sugar based on how sweet they are. So, and again, people can say what they want. They can have beliefs. And there's a talk of mine on YouTube called "Is Fruit Good or Bad for You?" where I literally just go through the biochemistry. I go through the history and how all of this was made up in 1991 in a meeting between the food industry and the American Cancer Association to show that having more fruit and veg is actually healthy for you. That's where the whole 5 a day came from. But the long and the short of it is, when they went back and looked at all of that stuff from 1991, it had nothing to do with what you ate. It was if you were from a higher socioeconomic group that happened to have access and be able to pay for fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, that they had a better cancer outcome. We've got these paradigms in society which are, it's literally, if you go up a freeway and there's a sign saying you are going the wrong way, you might get away with it for a little while, but given enough time, you're going to have a crash. And we as a society back in 1991, when it came to this 5 a day fruit and veg, went up the wrong highway. And, back in 1917, when we had the introduction of cereals and guidelines, we went up the wrong highway. And guess what? We're now paying the price. The whole of society is crashing because of our excess processed food, carbohydrates, sugar. Bang, we only have to look down the street to see that we've gone the wrong way.
So could we say that giving children 1 or 2 bowls of cereals every day for breakfast is not the best idea?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think if we actually look at that sugar part of those mood things that it does is actually creates some agitation, creates an addictive behavior. It makes children hungry. So if you eat sugar or carbohydrates, a bowl of cereal, 2 hours later, you're going to be hungry. You're going to be looking for morning tea. You're going to be looking for another sugar hit. Blood glucose goes up, it drops down too much because of the insulin produced. You're having a relative low, and then you go and looking for more sugar and carbohydrates. So we've ended up with a society which is doing this all the time with its blood glucose, but as a result of that, they need to eat every 2 hours. Now we didn't become, our ancestors didn't eat 7 or 8 times a day. They didn't have a snack when they woke up. They didn't have breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, after school dinner, or pre-dinner, dinner, and then an after dinner snack, and then a midnight treat. I mean, that's, as a society, our bodies have stopped fasting. Our bodies have not acclimatized to not eating. When, if you think, for thousands or millions of years, however long we've been on the planet, we did not have access to a refrigerator and 8 meals a day. It just didn't happen. So what we've done to ourselves now is one of the biggest social experiments of forever. And you've only got to walk down the street, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. And even developing nations which are taking on Western diets, you can literally, I've done foreign aid work, and you can literally see that within 20 years, probably 10, but let's say within 20 years, when a developing nation takes on a Western diet,
Yeah.
they develop Western disease.
And I think on a much quicker rate, probably.
Oh, but look, we have in our community, a whole lot of people have come from Tibet, Nepalese and Tibet, but they've come here and they all have medicals when they arrive. One of the doctors I know who looks after them has told me that within 12 months, 30% of them have diabetes, which they didn't have when they arrived. Within 2 years, 50% of them got diabetes. So all we've done is we've taken them away from their traditional society and their life and their food availability and given them an amazing amount of carbohydrates, processed food, and their systems succumb to that within a 2-year period. I mean, it's just a human tragedy because it's cheap, available, poor nutritional quality. And look, this would be fine if it wasn't turning out to be a health disaster for everywhere. It becomes a political topic now around the world about our health expenditure is beyond the capacity of the systems to actually manage. And it doesn't matter if we're here in Australia or Switzerland, the United States, Great Britain, developing nations, China's got one of the biggest rates of increasing obesity and diabetes in the world. It doesn't matter if you're in India or Sierra Leone, wherever you go, it's out of control.
So before we go on the guidelines topic, can we also speak about the seed oils as another product that has been introduced for a recent time in terms of evolution?
One of my crimes is when it was now probably nearly 13, 15 years ago, I described a nutritional model of modern disease. And I think what we've done is we've created a perfect storm. And I'll say that the combination of sugar, which is fructose, refined carbohydrates, which is the glucose, the cereals, and the seed oils, the polyunsaturated seed oils, combine together to give a perfect storm, which then creates inflammation in every blood vessel in the body and every cell, every tissue, every corner of the body is affected. And so and I started talking about this a long time ago now, came up against all sorts of barriers. And the more I looked into the science and the biochemistry, the more trouble I was getting into with the system. And I haven't lost a debate on the biochemistry of this ever, because it's glucose metabolism, it's fructose metabolism, and it's the seed oils. Now, you can argue, and we'll talk about the seed oils, you can argue which one's more trouble, but I think it's the combination of the three which is the major problem. So the thing about seed oils, or the polyunsaturated seed oils, is to think about oils versus fat. So we describe fat and oil based on what its constituency or consistency is at room temperature. So at room temperature, a fat is solid and an oil is liquid. All fats and oils are really based on what they're all the same. It's just based on what they are at room temperature. And they combine saturated fats in there and polyunsaturated fats. And in between, that's thing called a monounsaturated fat.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about saturated fat, it's chains of molecules all stuck together, which are very solid.
Mm.
So at room temperature, they're solid. At 37 degrees, at body temperature, they're liquid. But to create flexibility in nature, those fats can sometimes have one bond in it to create a bit of flexibility. And that is a monounsaturated fat. If you create lots of chains, lots of flexibility, lots of double bonds in it, that's a polyunsaturated. And if you've got 3 double bonds in it, that's an omega-3 fatty acid. We've got an omega-6, so we've got 6, and omega-9 is 9 double bonds, and omega-12. So therefore, when people hear, oh, they're omega-6 or fats and omega-9s and whatever, that's just referring to the number of double bonds in it. Now, in nature, a plant cannot afford in winter to have fat in it which becomes solid. That plant would freeze. So plants, and by nature their seeds, are full of polyunsaturated seed oils. So they've got flexibility so they don't freeze. That's why it's an oil. Whereas a cow, which produces fat, milk, blood, or a goat, which produces ghee and that sort of thing, that fat that they have in them is at 37 degrees, so it's actually got flexibility. Now, a plant cannot afford that because it's based on the ambient temperature. So plants and their seeds tend to be more omega-6, omega-9 fatty acids in them, creating the flexibility. And we as humans need a very small amount of omega-6, omega-9 in our bodies. 100 years ago, we probably had 1% of in our bodies was omega-6 linoleic acid. That's just one of the omega-6s. I'll come back to that. But over the last 100 years, that figure's gone from 1% to 2%. In the latest, in the 1950s, probably about 16, 17, 18%. And as we follow it up, it's now in the high 20s, maybe the low 30s. Mm-hmm. That 30% of the fat in our bodies is now omega-6 linoleic acid, which has got all these double bonds in it. Our bodies need 1%. We've now a 30%. Now, the thing about those double bonds is they create flexibility, but they're also points of weakness. And biochemically, those points of weakness can become oxidized. Mm. And the best way to describe that is a piece of steel. If it's left out in the weather, that becomes, it rusts. So that's oxidation in nature. So metal when it's got exposed, becomes oxidized, it's rust. It's nowhere near as effective. The same thing happens to a polyunsaturated oil. Every double bond has the capacity to become oxidized when it's exposed to oxygen. Now, when our bodies were 1% polyunsaturated oil, the body copes with that small amount of oxidation. We've now got 30% of our bodies, the fat in our bodies, in our cell membranes, our mitochondrial membranes, which are the engines of the cell. 30% of that is linoleic acid, an omega-6, which can become oxidized. So effectively, that's highly inflammatory. So I use an analogy. If you build your house out of bricks, it's solid. If you build your house out of kindling, it's highly inflammatory. And we as a society now are making our babies, our embryos, when they're 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, they need 30%, a third of the baby as it's developing is highly inflamed, becoming oxidized with an inflammatory process. So we're doing that. So is it any wonder that our babies are now born sicker than they were? Because the mothers, and it's I'm not trying to blame mothers. This is a society issue. If you actually, our embryos are inflamed, and the babies are born they're growing in an inflamed milieu, and they're raised in that. There's been data looking at women's breast milk out of the United States and out of African women. I can't remember the country in Africa. Nonetheless, the omega-6 levels in Western milk, in American women's milk, is 30%, and the ones in African women are 4 or 5%. We're a lot lower. That's fascinating, isn't it? What's the difference between a woman in Africa and a woman in the United States? Well, it's the food they eat. And so this data is there, and all I've ever put together is say, okay, if you actually eat a whole lot of sugar and you eat a whole lot of carbohydrate, the byproducts of that are the lipoproteins, which go all around the body, and particularly the small, dense lipoproteins. And if they go around the body, and those lipoproteins, if the fats within them are 30% omega-6, and those become oxidized, that means wherever we transport a small dense LDL, which is into every corner of the body, every blood vessel, every tissue, we are transporting oxidized inflammatory material around our bodies. And if you actually trace this historically, we started introducing margarine back in the 1920s, and it became a staple product in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, to the point in the 1970s it just really took off. You can actually track obesity, you can track modern disease, you can track cancer, cardiovascular disease, mental health issues, all of them on the same pathway. These conditions were rare in the last century. The previous one in the 1800s, in the 19th century. These conditions were all rare. But wherever you've introduced Western food, and particularly the modern Western food, you've literally, within 10 to 20 years, you've got increasing rates of obesity, mental health issues, cancer, cardiovascular disease, neuropathies. It's just, in my mind, clearly very, very strong association evidence. And there's lots of people throwing up saying, oh, it's got nothing to do with it and all that sort of thing. Well, I'm sorry, it does at a biochemical level. Glucose in excess is damaging our bodies. Fructose in excess is damaging our bodies. And if it all becomes oxidized, we've created the perfect storm of inflammation. And inflammation sits behind every single medical condition.
So you've explained the biological path and the side effects of these products. And we've seen this increasing rate of chronic disease and modern disease. But why these nutritional guidelines that have been put in place around the 80s, early 80s, and followed since then didn't change? Like everybody's getting worse, but the what we've applied and started this increase of chronic disease, we did not modify it since then.
Well, it comes, we're going up the wrong highway, aren't we? It's just a crash after crash after crash. I think it's really important to put things in a time frame. And you talked about the 1980s. So I'm going to go back to two time periods. I'm going to say one is October 23, 1917.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is a fairly specific date, 22 and 23, 1917. And the other time frame is to go back to the 1850s, when all of this started. And so the problem we all have is we believe our teachers, we believe our textbooks, and they believe their teachers and they believe their textbooks, and that's called a generational education. And so, in the I was around in the 1980s, you might not have been, but I mean, I was certainly, I'm a 60s lad. But if you question your teachers and your textbooks, you don't pass the exams. So everyone just does what over and over and over. So therefore, it's really important to go back in history. So if you look at October 22, 23, 1917, it was the formation of the American Dietetics Association in the United States. What was really interesting, it was a group of women who got together and with about 4 to 6 weeks' notice, they decided they're going to have a meeting and form the American Dietetics Association. What's really interesting, at that meeting, they were sponsored by 9 food industry groups.
Okay.
9 food industry groups were there at the very first meeting when they formed the American Dietetics Association. And there's a letter there related to that saying they actually made a profit. Now, I don't know if you've ever held a conference with 6 weeks' notice to get 50 or 60 people there. You never make a profit. Anyway, in 1917, they made a profit. At that formation of the American Dietetics Association, they formed the model of how all Western dietetics associations then followed. So it started with the American, and the Canadian, the British, the South African, the Australian, the New Zealand, some of the European ones, and I don't know them all, but nonetheless, they all took that model. Now, the person who founded the American Dietetics Association was a woman by the name of Lena Cooper. Lena Cooper went on to be the first dietitian for the American Defense Department. She wrote the textbooks for the next 40 years for dietetics for the world, for all these associations. Lena Cooper was a vegetarian who'd been working for John Harvey Kellogg. So she'd come from the Kellogg's breakfast cereal manifesto, and she preached a vegan, vegetarian, cereal-based agenda, which formed the majority of her textbooks. Remembering, these textbooks became the textbooks for the world. And we've got hold of some of those from the 1920s. It's quite phenomenal to find out that this is a vegan, vegetarian book. And that's no wonder, because she came from a vegan, vegetarian influence. And this is where it all becomes convoluted. And my wife, Belinda, has been really chased down this rabbit hole and is the world expert on this. So whatever I say is an abbreviated form of her knowledge. John Harvey Kellogg and William Keith Kellogg came up with breakfast cereal. They were both members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in Battle Creek, Michigan, 101 cereal companies were formed in the late 1890s to 1910, all virtually owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church or their members. That's what's really important about that is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a vegan, now corporate church, which owns 20 food industries around the world, not 20 food companies, food industries.
Mm.
So everyone goes, who's the Adventist Church? And I go, actually, well, they are they own the cereal, they started the cereal industry of the world. That's it. They started the Western soy industry of the world. They started infant soy formula for the world. They started the stevia industry for the world. They started the alternate meat industry for the world. They are the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. They are the biggest educator in the developing nations of the world, and their health message goes out across the world into most educational bodies, and it's vegan, vegetarian. Their belief is that when the world turns to vegan, vegetarian, but particularly vegan, then Christ will return. No, we're not anti-religious. Belinda was a Sunday school teacher. I mean, it's just incredibly confronting. Now, you can have your belief. That's fine. But you shouldn't be writing the dietary guidelines for the world and based on the food pyramid and having it 50% carbohydrate based on your commercial product, dating back to the 1890s, 1910s. They have positioned themselves within our health guidelines and our dietary guidelines for over 100 years. We happen to work it all out, but effectively they are at the highest levels of the World Health Organization. They're completely and inextricably linked in with the scientific bodies associated with nutrition. There's a group called ILSI, International Life Sciences Institute. Virtually every corporate food company in the world comes under the ILSI umbrella to effectively science wash this nutritional message, which is all just non-science. But they keep pushing it, and so it comes from these parent bodies. But ILSI was started by Coca-Cola. It's completely tied up with the food industries of the world. Those people have infiltrated, and there are people at the head of the World Health Organization advising this. In our Polynesian countries in the Pacific, 7 of the national leaders, whether or not presidents, prime ministers, are Seventh-day Adventists, which are taking people away from their traditional diets of food, of seafood and local produce to imported cereals and grains and seed oils. Because this is a corporate church pushing a food agenda on the world by controlling the dietary guidelines for the last 100 years. Because they've written the dietary textbooks, the generational education. And we've got the heads of different parts of, like the US Dietary Guideline Committee, the group that looked into whether or not meat's good or bad for you. The head of that person is Seventh-day Adventist, and he's written papers about this. And what's really important, people might think, okay, I'm making all this stuff up. He has written a paper called, in 2019, in a journal called Religion, about exactly I'm talking about, saying the role of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the dietary guidelines of the world. And what's really important about that, in the references, is Belinda's work. So we're not making this stuff up, because the church is very proud of the fact that they're trying to do this. And again, this would be fine, except that they are a small church They're a corporate church involved in food industries and food guidelines and education of our children and the future of the world. Now that's fine if it all worked, but the trouble is we're getting fatter and sicker because of our food guidelines. And our food guidelines are based on a vegan agenda, and it's on a plant-based agenda. It doesn't work. It doesn't work biochemically. It doesn't work historically. It doesn't work anthropologically. It just doesn't work. And the scary thing about it, if we actually work out, I think, some of your viewers will know, but why was breakfast cereal invented by the Kellogg's brothers? Do you know that one? Why was breakfast cereal invented?
I heard Dr. Anthony Chaffee speaking about it, but I'll let you develop that.
Anthony, we gave this information to Anthony some years ago, but effectively breakfast cereal was invented to stop us all from masturbating.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and that sounds just absurd, but I always encourage people, just Google cereal and masturbation, and I'll guarantee that the name John Harvey Kellogg will come up there straight away.
Mm.
And John Harvey Kellogg was quite a brilliant man. Not because of that. He came up with about 20 different medical patents. He's responsible for the modern hospital. Where you go to the hospital, it's multiple stories, it's lots of specialties, all centralized care. That's all based on the Battle Creek, Michigan Hospital, which became the model for all hospitals in the world going forward.
Mm.
Now, the reason that we work out that how did he come to this bizarre concept is that when he was a 12-year-old, he was working in the temperance, he was working in the 1850s. He went to live with the first family of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Ellen White and her husband. Ellen G. White is the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They've written, she was a prolific writer. She's the most published female author in the world.
Mm.
And it's all this ongoing propaganda spattered out. But as a 12-year-old, he was typesetting on the printing press a solemn message to mothers, which was on the perils of masturbation. And if you masturbated, you would spend all eternity in hell. Can you imagine being what was going through John Harvey Kellogg's mind as a 12-year-old typesetting that he didn't want to go to hell? He ended up getting married. They adopted 8 children, but he was completely obsessed with this concept of not masturbating because that was the vilest sin on the planet. And that's why he came up with breakfast cereal. Kellogg's cornflakes were invented, which was a bland food, had energy because it was just carbohydrate, to actually travel that path. He also was, and because masturbation was such a vile sin, he was into circumcision, clitoral ablation, water enemas. All sorts of bizarre things happened at the Battle Creek, Michigan. But world leaders, industrial leaders from around the world, went there because of their cleansers, their health clinics, and that sort of thing. And there was Henry Ford was there. There are some dark paths which the Kellogg's group were involved in, to do with sterilization, birth control, eugenics. That whole concepts are all tied around that early 19th century, early 20th century, around the early 1900s. Disturbing time in our lives. But at the time, as it turned out, they were involved in writing our textbooks, not just in nutrition. We talk about Rockefeller and Carnegie and the Flexner Report in 1910, which then developed the whole model of the pharmaceutical industry and our university-based education. So 1910 to 1917, very, very strong historically for developing our modern medical pathways, our modern nutritional pathways, and we just screwed it up completely. And then as we industrialized those processes, over time with the introduction of Crisco as a margarine. Crisco has actually been associated with saving the whales. Did you know that?
Saving the
Have you heard
whales.
the whales? Yeah, because prior to the late 1800s, whale oil was used for lighting, for fuel and for lights, and as time went on, the oils started being used, and then those oils meant that the whales weren't being slaughtered for their whale oil, but then there was a surplus of that oil, and they actually then started, and then we had the war years come through, and there was a lack of butter, and so they had this white stuff, which was polyunsaturated oils. And then they said, well, hang on, we don't have enough butter, but this stuff looks a bit like butter. Why don't we colour it yellow? And even only 30 years ago, you could actually buy white tubs of margarine with a yellow colouring to put into it, to stir into it, to make it look yellow. That was in the 1930s and 1940s. And then because of the price of animal products, they require storage, refrigeration, we started using more and more industrial seed oils into our food industry, into our food product. We had more sugar in there. We had more carbohydrates in it because it gave shelf life, storage, transportability. And with that history, and I've given a real short précis of it, we've now got our modern disease epidemic. And wherever we've introduced this modern Western food, sugar, carbohydrates, polyunsaturated seed oils, we've introduced Western disease.
So,
and when you stop eating them, you start getting better.
Yeah. So you've made a very, I think, understandable correlation between history and biology. And as you said, by the 80s, we've seen that increase of chronic disease. But that's also the time when fitness or fitness industry has become very important in our lives, at least in the West. And as a trainer, I leave off this work. I'm training people and like health coaching, I would say, more for the past 2-3 years, since I've introduced the nutritional aspect to it. But for more than 10 years, I've been practicing, personal training in a very normal way. But looking at it, I doesn't necessarily bring the expected outcome. Do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, look, my thoughts are pretty simple. If I was even been criticised by the medical board by making it too simple. But here's my way of explaining it. You've got a car. A lot of people have got a car. People pay more attention to what fuel they put in their car than what they do in their bodies.
Mm.
So if you've got diesel in your car, if your car needs diesel, you don't put unleaded in it, and vice versa. You've heard the term a little bit in moderation. Well, of course not. You don't put a little bit of unleaded petrol in with the diesel. You don't put a bit of diesel in with the unleaded, because over time it's going to cause troubles.
Yep.
And that's what we've been doing with our bodies. We've been putting the wrong fuel in our bodies for a long time. Now, you've got a choice. Your car is going to run more efficiently on a pure fuel, on the fuel it was designed to have. You've got a choice. You can keep putting the wrong fuel into your car and then putting in for more and more services and more repairs, and the car's not going to run as well, and it's going to need to be replaced. The trouble with our human bodies, we can't be replaced unless we die. But what we've got is now a society which is trying to outrun a bad diet, out-exercise a bad diet, is to medicating a bad diet. It is about treating, whether or not it's mental health issues or fitness or obesity or all of our things that we're complaining about in society, I think are lifestyle related problems that require a lifestyle management. I don't think we can medicate our way out of our bad diets. I don't think we can exercise our way out of our bad diets.
Mm.
Now, I was raised on sugar and carbs and seed oils. We had margarine in the house. I played an enormous amount of sport, but in retrospect, and I've had my hips replaced. In retrospect, I wonder whether or not my inflammatory diet, which was full of carbs and energy, contributed to the fact that my hips wore out when I was in my late 30s.
Mm.
I think it did. I can't go back and prove it. I can't do the double-blind crossover trial. I can't do it. But I know that I had a terrible diet growing up. And I've had my health issues over time. And I know that my health has improved dramatically by changing my diet. And if I go back 20 years, I was on half a dozen different medications for a variety of things that were creeping up. I don't need those now. Well, most people need more and more medication over time. I've needed less and less. The only thing that I've changed is I've taken out the sugar, the carbohydrates, and the polyunsaturated seed oils. I don't take supplements. I don't take vitamins. I don't take minerals. We talked about exercise, I walk, I golf, I garden aggressively. I'm red in the face today, probably because I, moved 15 cubic meters of mulch for an old man. So you can only lead by example. You can lead by example for your family, your friends, patients. I've ended up on this pathway because I got challenged by the system when I tried to lead by example by telling the community. But I'm not 100% right on anything. I'm married, so because I'm married, a wife will always tell you that you're never 100% right. But I'm more right than wrong on this topic. Get rid of ultra-processed food. It's a no-brainer. Put the right fuel in your body. Pay attention to the fuel you put in the body, just like the fuel you put in your car. Get the right amount of exercise to stimulate the muscles and get the protein back into your muscles.
But
stimulate your skeleton.
Exercise doesn't mean necessarily fitness, right? Like the fitness industry, because we've seen an explosion of and a rise of personal trainers over the last 20 years, I would say, 25 years. But I think it's more like an expression of a symptom rather than a real need or solution.
I think everyone should exercise to get fit for what they do in life. The first thing to do in life is to live. And if you need to, and it was a statistic I heard a long time ago that 90% of women in the United Kingdom under the age of 25 walk less than a kilometre per week.
Wow.
Because they get out of their house, walk to the tram or the train or the bus, go to work, sit down, and the reverse. And is it any wonder then 50 years, 70 years down the track, they've got osteoporosis? We've got a society that doesn't walk enough.
Mm.
So to me, fitness requires exercise and mobility and stretching. And that's got a short-term benefit for your health, your well-being, your mindset, all of that. It's got a medium-term benefit on your general cardiovascular health and your avoiding obesity, because it's hand in hand with nutrition. And I think it's got a long-term benefit of strengthening our bones, our muscles, our joints over time, because if you have poor balance, you've got poor muscle tone, you've got poor coordination and poor strength in your 80s, then you're more likely to fall over.
Mm.
So, I mean, I played, as I say, I play golf. I play in the veterans. Every week on a Monday, it's the veterans comp. And a few weeks ago, I played with three fellows who were 82, 84, and 87. They didn't hit the ball a long way, but they were out there doing some exercise, socializing, exercising their bodies, exercising their minds. They didn't look like they were going to fall over. Actually, I lie, the 88-year-old by the end of the round looked like he was going to fall over. But I mean, I find that inspirational that you can keep exercising. So what's the difference between exercise and fitness? I think you should exercise so that you're fit for different stages in your life, short term, medium term, and long term. That's what I'd call fitness.
Yeah.
I don't think we should all be aiming to do a marathon or a half marathon. You want to be fit for what you need to do. And certainly if you want to, we don't need to go to war anymore, most of us. So we don't need to be fit to go into battle. We do need to be fit to live.
Well, they use drones anyway, so.
That's right. So you need good thumbs.
But it's probably the pro gamers would be more suitable for wars now than soldiers. But yeah, I see fitness in a more preventive health approach now than a pure sports performance or athletic side. Even though
Well,
I do
sorry, go
train,
ahead.
I do train. I do some Muay Thai, wrestling, so which is very athletic. But if I have to train a 45, 50 years old person, I would not apply I would apply what you described more on a mid-term, long-term longevity approach. How do you train your body to preserve what you have and to make sure that in your later days, things will be more or less all right?
Most people are impatient. They want a quick fix, though.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing about nutrition. If you change away from the ultra processed food, and you know that I'm pro low carb, ketogenic, carnivore as you go down those pathways. You don't need blood tests. I just say to people, 3 weeks down the track, 4 weeks down the track, how do you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone feels great. Oh, I've had to pull in my waist. I had to do my belt up a bit tighter. These are, you don't need a series of blood tests to show people that they're healthier. I've got better exercise fitness. I can walk further. I'm not as hungry. I'm sleeping better. I'm breathing better. My joints don't hurt. The number of people, I wouldn't do knee replacements on people until they actually stopped carbohydrates. And 80% of the people with end-stage arthritis of their knees had significant relief of their knee pain to the point that they could delay their knee surgery. They might delay it by 3 months or 6 months or 5 years. But I said, until you do that, you haven't exhausted conservative management.
Yeah.
And again, that carbohydrate talk, that's another thing which what glucose does. It's actually inflammatory on joints. And the number of people who have given up processed food and say, my joints don't hurt as much. Yeah. My arthritis has gotten better. My autoimmune diseases have gotten better. If you stop putting inflammatory food into the body has an enormous capacity to heal itself and do it very quickly. I talked about the glycocalyx. Within 4 hours, your body is starting to reproduce that and give you a new glycocalyx. Within 4 hours. Within 2 weeks, liver function improves in children who give up sugar. It's all been documented. We just need, but because it's against the food industries, it's against the guidelines, it's against vested interests, that's why the message is a bit hard to get out there.
Do you think that these food corporations can actually make a change if the demand changes, or is their business model too profitable to initiate any change despite a different demand?
I don't think the food corporations want to change because it's their profitability of their food line. I am disappointed in society because there's a whole lot of nutritional supplements or keto bars or low carb. I actually think the vast majority of them are actually highly processed foods that you want to avoid. I come back to the original statement of mine: eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food. Local, eat seasonal. Go and support your farmer's market. Go and support your local farmers. Source that out, because that's where the benefit arises. But there's a whole food industry out there, a supplement industry, saying, someone contacted Belinda just the other day about this thing called allulose, as an artificial, different sweetener that's out there. Well, so that's a big, literally flavor of the month at the moment, where people are saying, I have allulose as a sweetener. And you start looking into it. Allulose starts affecting the gut. So you get gastrointestinal irritability, you start getting diarrhea, bloating. I'm just arguing we need to eat real food. The trouble is we've lost what the definition of real food is. Are the food corporates involved? Yes, the food corporates don't want us to travel this path. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't want us to travel this path because it means people coming off medications.
Yeah.
Only last night I was helping out a specialist in Norway, who's trying to come up against the same barriers that I've had over time. The guidelines need to change. Now in Australia, we're ahead of the pack. We've actually been able to change the guidelines around diabetes. The guidelines now say therapeutic carbohydrate reduction is the most effective first line, best practice guideline. That's taken 15 years of hammering against the wall. It is slowly changing. And the reason it's slowly changing is because people are doing it based on conversations that you and I are having right now. People are doing it because they start waking up and going, there must be a better way. People are doing it because it's sick and tired of going to the doctors with their health-related conditions which require a lifestyle decision, a lifestyle change. The governments are considering it because it's too expensive to keep band-aiding sick care. And this conversation we're having is not that long after the US election, where one of the mottos that Trump came in was make America healthy again. Now, whether or not you like him or not, Robert Kennedy is a changer. He's calling out the vested interests. I've had a personal meeting with him a few years ago. So I actually think he's a reasonable guy. He's actually well-intentioned, certainly well-informed. Now, I happen to know 3 of the people who are advising him,
Okay.
who are all on board with fresh, local, seasonal, real food, who all are aware of the vested interests of the food and the pharmaceutical industry that are trying to keep us sick. So I come back to the American Dietary American Dietetics Association, which formed the model for all Western food guidelines. So if you can change it in the US with all of their convoluted, screwed up mechanisms, then maybe we can change it around the rest of the world. And so I've got a bit of hope because people are listening to us. And I can remember, 15 years ago, I thought I was alone until I started meeting some other people who had like-minded concepts. And here we're having a conversation because we've got like-minded concepts. We don't have to agree on everything, but in principles we are. Good exercise, good food, good living, good sleep, good good family support. Get back to our roots.
And my
I
last.
don't think anything. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. I will ask you.
No, I just think I don't think. I try to actually seem rational. I might get worked up over it, but it's more the fact that I honestly think we've been lied to for over 100 years. which has suited a business model, but it hasn't suited a health model.
So I want to let you end up this conversation with maybe an advice as a surgeon and as a doctor. What would be the advice you would give to any health professional, meaning doctors, nurses, nutritionists, trainers, or physio? Every people who are working with a clientele or patients who are facing health issues. What would be your advice to these health professionals towards their patients or clients?
I so go and look at any of my talks on inflammation and look at any of my wife's talks about the vested interests which have been manipulating us for 100 years. But the reason I'm never going to lose a debate on this topic is because it's biochemistry. So you're a healthcare professional. The vast majority of healthcare professionals have forgotten their biochemistry. And I'm not talking about the rocket science biochemistry, the cellular biochemistry, the engines of our body, the mitochondria. If you can get your engines of the body working well, and that's based on biochemistry. Biochemistry is science. I think what happens with food inside our bodies is science. What happens with food outside our body is non-science. It's nonsense. It's politics. It's money. It's religion. It's just all made up. So if you are a proper healthcare professional, ignore the FUD, ignore what's coming to you from the drug rep, ignore what's coming from you from the guidelines, because I can guarantee every single guideline is written by people who have too much time on their hands and who have effectively been funded by the food industry. There's a textbook in medicine called Harrison's. It's the classic textbook. The authors of Harrison, I think it must be 4 or 5 years ago, had received $12 million from the pharmaceutical industry, which guides your guidelines. I mean, it's just, and I'm sorry I might sound cynical. No, I'm not sorry at all that I'm cynical. I think it's just the more you go down this pathway, you realize that our information's been manipulated.
Mm.
It's manipulated in all forms of media, but it hasn't been manipulated just for 5 years or 10 years or your education. It's been manipulated for over 100 years. And that's why we believe it, because it's been so entrenched in our behavior. So go back to the biochemistry. Don't trust the guidelines. Go back and think about eating real food. Okay. And if you fuel your body correctly, then the rest of the things will all start to fall into place. And you can do the exercise. You can improve your fitness, improve your well-being. And you can do it at any age. I've got one fellow who decided he started doing a ketogenic diet in I think he's 95, because he wanted to do more bushwalking. And he got better. He didn't need to lose weight. He got better mental clarity. He got better fitness. He was able to do more bushwalking. So don't tell me anyone's too late or too old to give it a crack. I've got people with uncontrolled diabetes. People who've got dementia don't go shopping, but they've got family who can actually go and feed them. And why not try that rather than just giving them all the sugar and the carbs and trying to make them feel happy, when you may in fact see an improvement or functional improvement. And Stephen Kinane in the US has done multiple papers about this now, showing that there is benefit there at any age to be doing it, and particularly with the neurodegenerative disorders. It's so frustrating that I don't see medical professionals offering this when they should. And I know why, because it takes time, takes effort, and you don't get paid for it. And you get into trouble if you don't follow the guidelines, which is medicate, medicate, medicate. Also, I can see the barriers for it, but I don't think there's an excuse for it. No, that was a long answer, wasn't it?
That was a great answer. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Fettke. I'll put in the show notes all the links so people can discover or rediscover your work and also Belinda's work. So I think these
Anyway,
are
thank you.
great.
We covered a bit more ground today.
That was great. Thank you very much for your time and your availability and also your work and I could say your legacy in a way. 'Cause-
Yeah, I did a talk about that recently, but not what I've done, but why I've done it.
Mm,
And I told the kids, look, we'll just replay that at my funeral with a little bit of a postscript.
okay.
Because I'm actually, like most people, I'm quite a complex person underneath it all. I found it quite challenging to actually give a talk about me rather than about the system.
That's
But anyway,
online.
it is, yes, yeah.
Okay. So
I'll send you a link to it. It
okay.
hasn't been seen that many times, but it was I only did that a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a personal journey one.
Must be very interesting. Thank you very much,
I
Gary.
I'm fascinated. I don't think I'm as interesting as other people think I am, but anyway.
I think that there's what you say, as you say, biochemistry is science, which is neutral in a way, and then there's always the personal journey that someone is carrying a message or something. And despite the barriers that you have, I mean, you've done it, very courageous manner, and I think, yeah,
I'm still alive. It's okay to tell everyone that the guidelines are wrong.
Yeah.
And then go along and prove it.
Yeah.
But you tend to upset a few people because they don't like saying that, letting them know that they're wrong, and they certainly don't like it when you tell them that they've actually been paid by the food and pharmaceutical industry.
Hmm.
But that was part of our last interview. So you keep well, mate. We'll catch up.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much, Gary.
Okay.
Bye-bye.